Hey everyone, this video is going to be an overview of the bow class. First, we're going to go over all the basic abilities and passives that the bow has, and then we'll go into each bow specifically, look at what the E does, and sort of the activities it's good for, as well as an example build that you can run with it. So starting off with the Q abilities, first we have multi-shot. This just fires a cone of arrows in front of you that knocks targets back a short distance and does damage. This is pretty much a PvP exclusive spell, as its damage is lower than the other two Qs, and it's helpful for keeping your distance, peeling off melees, and also interrupting enemy casts. The second Q is Deadly Shot, which fires an arrow that goes through enemies, lowering their resistances, making everything that hits them do more damage. This is essentially just your general purpose Q, always solid, it has damage amp, it's AoE, it's long range, it's really never a bad option. The last Q you have available is Poisoned Arrow, which shoots a poisoned arrow at a target enemy, which applies a stacking poison debuff to them, which caps out at 3 stacks. This is technically the highest single target damage skill, but it's actually not that much higher DPS than Deadly Shot, so really it only gets used in combination with things that use dots well, like Mercenary Jacket, or in combination with other dots. Moving on to the Ws, next we have Explosive Arrows. When you activate this, you get a buff for the next 10 attacks that makes almost all of your attacks explode in magic damage. So this spell will proc anytime you auto attack or anytime you hit something with a Q, and most Es will also proc this ability. Poison Arrow and other dots will proc it on the first application, but not past then. This is essentially your damage option for Ws, as it's a very high damage spell if you consider all 10 instances of damage, which makes it your go-to PvM skill. Our second W is Frost Shot, which after a brief delay will launch you backwards and slow enemies in the area in front of you where you cast it. This ability is very strong, it's borderline overpowered, it is a great mobility spell, and it also slows down opponents, so it is top tier in PvP and anything that you need to kite or get your space. The third W option is Speed Shot. You essentially target an enemy, shoot an arrow at them, and then get an attack speed and movement speed buff. This W is the least used because it's pretty weak overall. Not many bows get value from attack speed, and move speed is just worse than the mobility from Frost Shot. So in general, don't use this ability. The last option for W is Ray of Light. You choose a small area on target ground, and then shortly after, an arrow will fall from the sky and deal damage and root any enemies caught in it. This is a pretty solid ability, but not actually used very often. You really only use it when you specifically want hard CC. It's sort of in the middle of Frost Shot and Explosive Arrows in terms of damage and mobility or counter mobility, so usually if you're in a matchup or activity where you want damage, you go Explosive Arrows, and if you want more mobility or counter mobility, you go Frost Shot. Moving on to the passives, our first passive is Slow Poison. Really, this passive is really bad, you're never going to use it. In PvM, there's just better passives than ones that slow mobs, and in PvP, the slow amount is just so minuscule, it's not worth it. Next we have the Energetic passive, which is a super solid energy regen passive, especially on auto attack based bows. Really, a lot of the time you have the option of either running the Energetic passive or having to run some sort of energy regeneration like a Limmer's Cape in your build, and so often you're just going to run the Energetic passive instead. The third passive is Piercing Arrows, which is your damage option for your passive. It's very good damage amp. It makes your arrows apply a stacking debuff, which makes the target take more damage from all sources. Lastly, we have Attack Speed passive, which is super niche, and it's a decent numbers passive, but in reality it's not really used that often because, as we're going to talk about, only one bow really wants to use attack speed. Moving on to each of the bows specifically now, we're going to start with the normal bow. So with the normal bow, after you press E, you get a buff for your next 18 arrows or your next 18 auto attacks. As you fire, you get a buff that increases each arrow damage and attack speed. The max stacks is 6 on you, and once you reach that, your arrows will also start shredding their resistance. Now note that this buffs you so you can switch targets freely and not lose any of your stacks. Also important to note that the buff lasts for 5 seconds and resets every time you auto attack, so if you don't auto attack for 5 seconds, you're going to lose your stacks and have to start over. Now the cooldown is 20 seconds, but what is nice about this ability is that the 18 arrow buff lasts for 30 seconds, so if you don't find a target right away and you're waiting around a lot, you don't really have to worry about having wasted your E, because you pretty much have 100% uptime. So in the current state of the game, the normal bow is a very strong weapon, one of the best weapons in the game, as it has some of the highest single target shred of any weapon. It's consistent, it's long range, and it's very easy, making it just a really solid weapon for focusing down a single target. This makes it solid for really any 1v1s, especially corrupted dungeons, as well as all small and mid-sized group PvP, and makes it top tier for any PvM that is focused on single targets like some Ava comps or the Ava Roads chests or any bosses. For an example build, I actually did a video dedicated to the normal bow earlier, so if you want to check out a more in-depth look at builds, I'll link that one in the description, but a standard build you can run is Cleric Robe, Assassin Shoes, Assassin Hood, Thetford Cape, using Deadly Shot on your Q, Explosive or Frost Shot on your W, and then the Energetic passive. Now just to note, you'll see that we don't run any attack speed despite it being an auto attack weapon, because the damage output is already high enough that it's going to force defensives whenever you're focusing somebody down, and if you are free fighting in a backline, you'll run out of your 18 arrows before your cooldown is back, and so attack speed would just amplify this problem and give you more downtime. Really, it can increase your damage burst, but realistically it's better just to go into other aspects of your build, other damage, other utility, or other defensives. Moving on to the warbow, the warbow has a very simple E. You just fire out an arrow that does damage to the first thing it hits, and it does more damage at longer range. One of the highlights of this ability is that it has a very short cooldown at 10 seconds. In the current state of the game, and for a very long time now, the warbow has been the quintessential Albion's kiting weapon. If you like running circles around your opponent, poking them down, this weapon is for you. Now the warbow is quite weak for PvM and also for group PvP, as its overall damage output is a little bit low. However, it is a very solid top tier weapon for pretty much all solo PvP. Whether you want to do corrupted dungeons or open world, warbow is a top tier choice. An example build you can run is Guardian Helm, Assassin Jacket, Assassin Shoes, Thetford Cape, running either the Deadly Shot or Multi-Shot for your Q, Frost Shot or Ray of Light for the W, and the Energetic passive. Moving on to the last of the non-artifact bows, we have the Longbow. Its E is an AoE channeled ability that does damage over time. The cooldown clocks in fairly shortly at 15 seconds. Really, the star of this weapon is its great synergy with explosive arrows, as it will proc on every hit of the E, and all targets will take damage from the other explosive arrows if you hit many at the same time. This means that it has the potential to be a very explosive weapon. Now in the current state of Albion, the longbow can be run for group fame farms, but really it's almost an exclusive ZVZ weapon, and a relatively interesting and underused one at that. The longbow's E does physical damage, meaning its damage to the front line is going to be quite low, whereas its damage to the back line is going to be quite high. And it also has a 15-second cooldown E, which means you can get 2 off in one engagement in a ZVZ if you use something like an Assassin Hood. Essentially what this boils down to is that it has very high potential, but it's often not as effective as something more standard like a Brimstone. If you hit a nice flank on the enemy's backline and get 2 big E's off, you can shred an entire clump by yourself. However, it's fairly unlikely that situation is going to come up. For an example build, you can run Assassin Hood, Cleric Robe, Scholar Sandals, Fort Sterling Cape, Resistance Potions, and Beef Stews. For your abilities, run Multi-Shot on the Q, Explosive Arrows on the W, and Piercing Arrows for the passive. Moving on now to the artifact bows, first we have the Whispering Bow. Its E is a toggleable ability with a cooldown as well. It makes you take more damage when it's active, but it also gives your auto attacks both longer range and a magic damage bolt applied to them whenever you attack. This weapon is very similar to the normal bow. It's an auto attack focused single target weapon. However, unfortunately, it's not often used, as the normal bow just does more damage in most situations. In order to really get the full potential of the Whispering Bow and get really high damage numbers, you have to build into it with damage stats, such as things like attack speed. This naturally just sacrifices other important parts of your build like utility and survivability, so generally speaking the bow is just chosen over it. So the Whispering Bow is good in the same situations as the normal bow is in things like solo and small scale PvP, however it's generally a little bit worse for PvM. One thing it is better at is in open world PvP, as you get a little bit more space to work with where you can really take advantage of the bonus range. Looking at an example build, this bow really benefits from attack speed, so we're going to build a lot of it with a Hunter Jacket, Mage Cowl, Assassin Shoes, Limhurst Cape, and then for abilities you go Deadly Shot, Explosive Arrows, or Frost Shot. You can use Speed Shot, but generally Explosive is a better for damage, and then the Attack Speed passive. Moving on to the Soul Artifact Bow, we have the Wailing Bow. Its E is it fires a big arrow, and it does more damage the more targets it passes through, capping out after 3 targets. This is the first bow that we've covered that has a standard 30-second cooldown. So the Wailing Bow really is a ZVZ exclusive weapon. You can't really use it very effectively for anything besides ZVZs. Similar to the Longbow, it's also a physical damage E, so it makes it very effective for killing the backline. However, due to the nature of how the Wailing Bow works, you usually do that by shooting your arrow through the front line into the backline. That being said, it can be quite effective at flanks as well, where you're only hitting backline. When building the Wailing Bow, you can feel free to go fully into damage, as its E is an instant cast, which makes it a pretty safe weapon to run in ZVZs, so I like to run Royal Hood, Cleric Robe, Royal Sandals, Fort Sterling Cape, and then Resistance Potions and Omelets. The next bow that we have is the Bow of Badon, which fires an arrow. First thing that it hits creates an electrical circle, which does damage over time and interrupts spellcasting. If an enemy leaves the circle, the damage and interrupt will last for a short period of time. Again, this is a standard 30-second cooldown E. Now, in the current state of Albion, this weapon is a little bit weak, but in general, it's just a pretty well-rounded bow with a versatile E. Because of this, it can pretty much be used for any activity. It's the OG Fame Farm weapon for bows, so it's still quite good for things like group dungeons and okay for solo dungeons, but in my opinion the best activity for it right now is 1v1 corrupted dungeons, where you can take advantage of the Mercenary Jacket. Small group and medium-sized group PvP it can also do well in, as well as ZVZs. It does have a super niche place. A small note about this bow is that if you're running explosive arrows, similar to Poison Arrow, it will proc on your E on the first hit, but the ticks of damage afterwards will not proc explosive arrows. For your build, it really depends on what activity you're doing. I mentioned I think Corrupted Dungeons are the best, so here's an example build for Corrupted Dungeons. Cleric Cowl, Mercenary Jacket, Sandals of Purity, Thetford Cape, Resistance Potions, and Omelets. For abilities, you can go any of the Qs depending on the situations. For your W, it's always Frost Shot, and for your passive, it's almost always Energetic. Last but not least, we have the Avalonian Bow, or the Mist Piercer. When you activate this weapon's E, you get 4 charges of arrows, and you press E to release 1 arrow. Things to note with this E is that it's magic damage, so it does more damage to tanks than some of the other bows. However, the E does not proc explosive arrows. It's also affected by cast speed modifiers, so if you're trying to get all 4 arrows out right away, if you don't have any cast speed, it will be quite slow. However, if you do have cast speed with something like a Scholar Robe, it will be very fast. In the current meta, the Mist Piercer shines in group activities, especially very large-scale ones like ZVZs, and can also be used for group fame farms quite well. In terms of ZVZing with bows, the Mist Piercer is definitely the top tier option right now over the Longbow and the Wailing Bow. An example build for the Mist Piercer would be Assassin Hood, Scholar Robe, Royal Sandals, Fort Sterling Cape, Resistance Potions, Beef Stews, and then for your abilities, Multi-Shot on the Q, Frost Shot on the W, and Piercing Arrows for your passive. Okay, and there you have it. That is all the bows in Albion. I hope you learned a lot in this video and what bow that you want to use the most. If you do enjoy this kind of content, make sure you like the video and subscribe.